Hello and welcome to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, February 14th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined again by Emma Cotton, who is a reporter for VTDigger. She covers the energy, environment, and climate. Thank you for making the time for this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew. It's great to be back.
I was thinking energy, environment, and climate must be a fascinating beat to have.
Yes, and right now there's so much conversation about all of those different things. I think you think about climate change, you think about Vermont with the catastrophic flooding that we had over the summer. I think there's so much going on with this, with all of these different issues right now. So definitely never a dull moment on this beat.
Well, I guess what I wanted to do was just kind of go over some of those recent stories that you've had in Digger, and kind of talk a little bit about them. One of them that you had earlier this week was on Act 250 reform. The role of Act 250 in trying to kind of find a pathway towards making it possible to build more workforce affordable housing has been always kind of interesting. I wonder if you could just bring us up to speed on what the legislature is thinking around how to balance those two things.
Okay, so Act 250 is a really interesting law. I think it's designed to give developers, or outline sort of community standards for how and where we want development. So it outlines these 10 different criteria that development has to meet to get an Act 250 permit. And once you have an Act 250 permit, the people who live near that development project can appeal the project. And you hear from developers often that if that appeal process takes place, it can take a year or 2 years to eventually be able to move forward with that project. And so when you're thinking about the housing crisis in Vermont, that can be a burden. That can be difficult. It can be difficult to move those housing, projects forward in a way that I think Vermonters want to see. And so at the same time, you have environmentalists who are looking at development in the state and who worry about how that development could be encroaching on critical resources. So forest blocks, for example, that are also, in the eyes of environmentalists, really important for, soaking in carbon and sort of addressing the climate crisis at the same time. And there is data to show, as recent as 2020, that around 12,000 acres of forest are being sort of encroached on in Vermont every year by development. So there's sort of these two different priorities that we're seeing. And Act 250, I think, is being seen more and more as sort of a burden to, being able to move our housing forward in a timely way. So a law passed recently required over the summer this steering committee to get together. And that the steering committee had developers on it. It had members of the Natural Resources Board, which administers Act 250, and environmentalists who all came together and, to the surprise of a lot of folks, actually came to a consensus and decided that, if you're going to move forward reforms on Act 250, those reforms should lift Act 250 jurisdiction in certain areas to make it easier to grow for, municipalities to grow in areas that feel appropriate. And also it would install some environmental protections. So they came to this consensus, but the consensus was pretty bare bones. It was kind of an outline of these different things. It didn't really, hammer out the details. That's what legislation is for. So right now in the legislature, we have 4 different bills that address this sort of compromise in different ways. And the reason why we're talking about this right now is because Phil Scott at his press conference last week took aim at one of those bills that is a little bit more focused on expanding Act 250 jurisdiction in order to conserve the environment. It also loosens some, Act 250 jurisdiction in some places to make housing easier, but that's sort of, it's not a housing bill. It's sort of how do we conserve natural resources? So, it was an interesting set of remarks by the governor, I think, because while he was taking aim at that one particular bill, he also sort of had this remark that, he sort of singled out the Vermont Natural Resources Council as a special interest group, and said, their priority is to conserve the environment. My priority is to make Vermont affordable and to make it safe. And so, we have two different sets of priorities. And I think to some in the building, that was a signal that maybe the governor is not ready to take on the environmental protections part of that consensus, which is all just really interesting because, I think it's the first time that there really has ever been a consensus like this on Act 250. So we'll have to sort of wait and see what the governor's opposition means if he's opposing this particular bill or if he would oppose other bills that do have some environmental protections. I think that sort of remains to be seen, but it's something we're going to continue to cover.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like the governor wasn't exactly jumping for joy at the thought that, oh, we're finally going to break this knot here and we'll be able to do two things at once to get more housing, which is so desperately needed, and at the same time, keep Vermont a green sanctuary. I guess I'm just surprised that he seems to be kind of so dug in on wanting to kind of not have anything get in the way of the housing solving it. I mean, I mean, obviously that's very important and critical, but it would seem like there must be some way to make this happen without kind of doing things like breaking up contiguous forest blocks, which is something I hear an awful lot about down here, and just sort of having some of the problems that spawned the original legislation back in the early 1970s kind of repeat itself. I don't know.
Yeah. It is interesting to look at. I think in years past, he's been successful in, encouraging legislation along that has provisions for housing, but has fewer provisions for the environment. And so maybe he sees a pathway forward there. It was very interesting to speak to developers on this and hear them say, we are ready to compromise and we are ready, to include these environmental provisions in the bill. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see, what bill out of the four actually does gain traction and what he, eventually ends up doing with that.
Well, we will definitely be following that one with great interest. Housing is topic number one down here for sure. But I wanted to move on to, because you've been publishing so many stories that we need to get to a whole bunch more here. And one of them that caught my eye last week was the one about concern about the bee exposure. And here we go, neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoids. It's a tough one for
close?
everybody.
I guess it's some concern about a pesticide that is killing the bird and bee populations and harming pollinators that are critical to diversified food production systems. I mean, I wonder if you could unpack some of that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really interesting issue to me because these are two different types of agriculture, right? So you have dairy farming, which, dairy farmers often use corn to feed their animals, and soy. And when they do that, they very often use seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids. We can call them neonics. And basically that's it's an insecticide designed to impact and sometimes kill insects, that it's a very small amount. It's just coating the seed, but it impacts pollinators in very small amounts. So it's sort of taken up through the plant's system, and it can be expressed even in a plant's pollen. And they're finding that neonicotinoids, even when they're just, it's a seed that's coated with a substance, they're still finding evidence of this substance in the soil where there hasn't been anything planted. So there's sort of evidence that it's traveling throughout the environment, and it can show up on, apple tree blossoms, which is, of course, something that a lot of pollinators are using and benefiting from. So the conversation is, do we continue to use seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids. I mentioned there are two types of agriculture here. The other type is beekeepers. And beekeepers are insect farmers. And, their charge is to make sure that their insects stay healthy. So it's sort of difficult when you have a pesticide that's trying to harm insects, and then you have insects that you're trying to, make sure are healthy. So, Vermont beekeepers are saying that they're seeing a lot of colony loss. They have reported, at least some of them are really not doing well. They're saying that their queens are surviving for less, their colonies are surviving for less time. And there are a number of factors that are impacting bees, including pesticides, which is the main piece of this conversation, but also, other pests like the varroa mite. Climate change is a factor here, weather's a factor. So, I think one of the big conversations is can dairy farmers find seeds to use that are not treated with neonicotinoids? That's been a really big topic of conversation, and I think the jury's out. Still, Vermont has sort of introduced this bill in part because New York actually just banned seeds with neonicotinoids with some exceptions. So there's some thought that maybe the market will change enough that Vermont dairy farmers can access, seeds that aren't treated with neonicotinoids. But then, there remains the question, can dairy farmers, make sure that their crops are safe? Can they protect them from I think it's the corn seed, or maybe the seed corn. The seed corn maggot, which has been really destructive to a lot of the corn crops. So, there's still that need for farmers to do that. There's some research to suggest that neonicotinoids are not actually that effective at protecting these plants, that there isn't really a difference between plants that have that treatment and plants that don't, crops that don't. But there's a lot of nuance in that research, and we're still sort of trying to understand how farmers can best protect their crops. So, the Agency of Agriculture weighed in on this yesterday in committee and said, we're just trying to make sure that all of these different types of farming can survive, and we're really concerned about impacting, the very strong dairy industry in Vermont that is also, struggling due to a number of factors. And then you have the beekeepers who are like, our colonies are failing, and we really need some help with this. So my impression is that the lawmakers in the House Ag Committee are pretty committed to moving this bill forward right now, that would ban neonicotinoid treated seeds with some exceptions. So we'll have to see where it goes. This is not the first time the legislature has contemplated altering the laws and the rules on neonics. And in the past, they decided to study it rather than sort of take any further action. So we'll see where it goes this year.
And so another one of your, I thought, really interesting stories the last couple of weeks was about how Vermont is one of the leaders in the country in installing heat pumps, which sounds pretty good, I guess. But we on a per capita basis, we have, let's see, what do we have here? We've installed around 63,000 heat pumps, about 97 heat pumps for every 1,000 residents, at least according to Efficiency Vermont. Wow, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, in part because you can see state officials and municipal officials sort of scrambling to try to get Vermonters to do this more. I think the clean heat standard is an example of that, just sort of scratching our heads and trying to figure out how, we can encourage Vermonters to electrify. Of course, the goal here is to bring down climate emissions that come from heating our homes. And recent data suggests that that is one of the biggest sources of climate emissions in the state is heating and cooling buildings. It's rivaling transportation at the moment. So it is really interesting that Vermonters are making this choice. When I talked to Efficiency Vermont, they said, they have a long history of providing incentives to folks to do this, and they've partnered with other organizations and utilities and contractors who have sort of presented this unified message to Vermonters that cold climate heat pumps can work in the state of Vermont in such a cold state. And I think that's one of the reasons that Vermont is sort of leading in the Northeast, at least, because I think they have been pretty proactive about trying to get folks to install these systems, and they've had a pretty coordinated approach with utilities. So, I think one thing to note though about this is we have a little bit of data to show how many low income or moderate income folks are installing these systems, and it's less. I think it's a pretty small percentage of the total, and that's because these can be really expensive to install. You have to have your home has to be sort of weatherized in the appropriate way. To make it work. And there's still a pretty large upfront cost. And so I think some of these other regulatory systems that we're talking about are trying to figure out, how we make that more equitable and even across, across different groups of people who are trying to do this. But yeah, so far it seems like Vermonters are opting to go with heat pumps.
That's interesting. So those incentives must be having some effect, I guess. I just was wondering, have you heard any concerns from like the electric utilities that, if this were to keep on going, the electrical supply, the grid would be robust enough to kind of handle that increased demand? I mean, I assume they must be feeling fairly confident around that, but with everything moving towards electricity as a replacement for fossil fuels, you just would begin to wonder, okay, is the grid up to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that based on our adoption of heat pumps alone, I think that we're doing okay. But I think as we advance and try to electrify and try to, push more electric vehicle adoption, and get more and more people to adopt heat pumps. And I think the focus really right now is on electrification. I think there are a lot of grid updates that do need to happen. But I think that's sort of a longer term conversation.
All right, all right. Well, so meanwhile, kind of related to, I guess, to that, last year the legislature passed the Affordable Heat Act, which was, I guess, a 2-year process designed to help transition to more renewable fuels, renewable fuel sources, and migrate away from fossil fuels. And I guess I just wondered, based on what you're seeing in the State House, how's that all going? Is that process kind of flowing in the way the writers of the Affordable Heat Act were hoping for, or what?
Yeah, so I think the way this has worked, the Affordable Heat Act was setting up a clean heat standard, and the details of this are a little bit wonky. The bill basically describes what it wants a clean heat standard to be, and sort of contemplates creating it, but doesn't implement it. It says the Public Utility Commission, which regulates sort of energy matters in Vermont, needs to create a blueprint and design how this program is going to work and really flesh out a lot of the details and get input from a bunch of different stakeholders. And then they need to come back before lawmakers by 2025 and present their plan to lawmakers. And then lawmakers will decide. They'll have more information about what the cost of this might be, because the cost has been widely debated. There have been estimates all over the place about what this is going to cost folks. So, they'll have more information and more sort of models and studies to look at that point, and then they can make an informed decision about whether it's a good idea to move forward with this. And just a reminder, the Clean Heat Standard would set up sort of a credit system. So the folks who are bringing fossil fuels into the state would have to pay into that system, and that would go toward installing cleaner, sort of more efficient heating systems. And the idea is that those credits would be sort of make it easier for folks like we're talking about who have lower incomes to upgrade. But there's just still so much unknown about what those credits would be worth and what that program would actually look like, and whether it's going to be as effective as some folks are hoping that it would be.
Yeah, well, that's been a fascinating process to watch, and will continue to be, I'm sure. Because I mean, the state's starting to come up with a couple of deadlines on their renewable energy goals and what have you. And you had an additional story kind of related to all of that about, will there be changes to the renewable energy standards? That gets, this one gets wonky too, at least to me it seems like it gets wonky very quickly. But I guess there's a bill that would amend the renewable energy standard to require new in-state renewable procurements to rise to 20% by 2030. So that would be 20% of the renewable energy would be generated in state. Is that realistic? I mean, I've heard people say, well, yeah, that's no problem. That should be no problem. But other people think that that's going to be a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think you have people who are saying, yeah, we can do that. And you have people who are saying that's going to be a really big challenge. It's going to, require us to potentially, I think I've seen sort of double the amount of, in-state renewables that are currently on the ground. So this bill, the Renewable Energy Standard, was passed in 2015, and it really makes Vermont's energy supply look pretty green. Right now, it's utilities need to purchase 75% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2032. This would update that standard and require utilities to purchase 100% of their renewable energy by 2030. And on that broader goal, utilities are pretty all in. There's not a lot of debate or argument about the ability to reach that broader goal. But like you're saying, the devil's in the details, and there are different tiers of this standard. And so one requires utilities to purchase an increasing amount over time of electricity power from regional renewable sources, so beyond Vermont, but they have to be able to connect to Vermont's, New England's grid. It's all connected. And then there's an additional requirement that requires utilities to increase the amount of power that they're purchasing from in-state sources. So there's all these sort of different tiers, and different utilities are required to do different things. It's very sort of scaled as the bill's currently written. But the goal of this is to, sort of purchase enough renewable energy that it actually displaces some of the natural gas from New England's grid, because, we can purchase as much renewable energy as we want to, but a lot of the electrons that are actually traveling through our power lines are coming from natural gas because we can't really differentiate. So the hope is that we're going to, raise this enough so that we're actually sort of displacing some of that and thereby reducing climate emissions. But like you're saying, I think there are also higher costs that, for payers that are associated with some of the proposals that are requiring more in-state, renewable energy. So, I have a feeling that this bill might change a little bit before it reaches the finish line here. We're still pretty early on. But yeah, I mean, like you're saying, it gets complicated when you look at it closely, for sure.
I mean, 20% of the overall state's electricity being produced from in-state renewable sources, I mean, it sounds like, okay, that should be possible, but it seems like every time I've heard of somebody proposing like a solar farm someplace, the local reaction, or at least the people who live around it, is like, no, 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 no. Everyone likes solar power and thinks it's great, but they just don't want it to be where they have to look at it. And so given that kind of, tension between, how these solar or geothermal or wind, energy sources are supposed to be developed here in the state, I mean, it just seems like that's always been this very agonizing process where, again, it takes much longer than everyone thought it would, and if they get built at all. And I guess I just find myself wondering, even though 20% doesn't sound like a lot, even getting a few percentage points more is likely to be problematic.
Yeah, and I think, it's difficult also to have conversations in Vermont about renewable energy that goes outside of solar or hydroelectric. So, wind has sort of been a really difficult topic in Vermont. I think a lot of Vermonters don't want to see wind turbines in the state. It's sort of been like, I've heard people say there's sort of a moratorium on wind in Vermont. And, I think, like you're saying, there are some permitting challenges related to getting renewable energy built, and there's definitely a fair amount of local opposition. I can think of sort of Shaftesbury. There was a very big solar project proposed. And part of this too is that, I think we may need some bigger solar projects to actually meet these goals. And I think those are the projects that have Vermonters a little bit more nervous. So moving forward, it could be challenging, unless some of that changes.
Well, before we have to run here, I just did want to ask one last question, more of a kind of a purely journalistic one. Since, like I said at this when we started, I think you must have one of the most fascinating beats in the entire newsroom there at Digger, because there's so much interconnections. I mean, what you're covering kind of takes you into so many different areas. Where do you get your story ideas from? Is it just some talking to people and kind of, keeping tabs on what's going on, or how do some of these ideas get to your laptop?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of our story ideas come from tips, which is one of the things I love about working at VTDigger. People write into us all the time, and they have things that they're curious about, and want answers about. And, we try to make time to be able to do that. I mean, I think most of the ideas are sort of reader based or reader inspired. And then, of course, we're scouring the agendas of the committees in the legislature to try to figure out what the big stories are there. And I'll admit that some of the stuff is these are things that I want to know. I think I've always been I love to hike, I love to be outside, and so the natural resource questions are really interesting to me. As are the questions about some of our state's most beloved industries like agriculture and how those intersect with our environmental priorities. I mean, Act 250 to me is such an interesting topic because it sort of is where the rubber meets the road in some cases with housing and the environment, which are two things that we care about so much in this state. So sometimes it's just finding a thread and following it for years at this point. So, but I think reader tips and reader emails are where some of my favorite story ideas have definitely started.
So one last funny question. Any forecast so far for maple syrup season? Right on the corner of that, with the winter having been, at least down here anyway, kind of on the warm side.
I have heard that some of the taps are already running. I've seen some sort of posts on social media that maple producers are really have hit the ground already. And I think that that's becoming more and more common. I've heard that folks have even started in January, or have had one-off sort of runs in January. So yeah, absolutely. I think that we're seeing that more and more on the early side these days. Yeah.
Yeah, crazy. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, Emma. But thank you again for your time and for being with us and sharing your reporting with us. Always a pleasure. And we're not going to wait another 2 years to have you back on. So that was way too long. Anyway, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. Anytime.
And thanks to all of you who have been with us today. Hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Always great to have on Emma Cotton from VTDigger. Thanks for being with us. Take care.